Hi there, everybody. My name's Terry Heaton, and I've written a book called "The Gospel of Self: How Jesus Joined the GOP," and I want to talk to you about a practice that I've been a participant in for the past 20 years. It's called deconstruction, and in this personally, I spend a great deal of time challenging my own assumptions about life and the things that I think I know. I believe this is important because, it's the only thing that will guarantee that I have a seat at the discussion table downstream. I need to understand where my understanding comes from. And so I have spent a great deal of time going back and, re-examining things that I assume to be true, things that I assume I know, things that I assume that drive the thinking and mostly the behavior of myself towards my fellow man. And so, I'm going to talk to you over the next few weeks or so about some of the assumptions that I've challenged for my own that may convince you to take a second look at your own assumptions. And I want to start at a very basic place, which is the assumption that you view life from a biblical perspective, or from what's called a biblical worldview. And this is so important because it's foundational to our morals, our values, our behavior, and in how we address the culture. So what is a biblical worldview? And why do I think that I have one? Well, I don't have one because somebody told me I have one. And I don't have one because this is what is expected of me from a Christian perspective. So when we look at the phrase biblical worldview, the first question I ask is, what Bible? What Bible do you use to give yourself a biblical worldview? Because there are many, many translations. There are many explanations of those translations. There are, the Bible has been dissected, and theology, the very, study of God, includes to a great extent the study of the Bible. So whose theology do you follow in determining that you have a biblical worldview? I would argue that you're just using the phrase because you've heard it elsewhere, because your church maybe uses the phrase, your friends maybe use the phrase, the people you run with maybe use the phrase, and maybe even people you respect and follow use that phrase. But you have to really step back and think about what that means. Because, if it's a biblical worldview that you have, then what Bible, whose theology, whose translation, whose explanations determine that you have a biblical worldview? Secondly, if it's not a biblical worldview you're talking about, then perhaps it's a Christian worldview. And I've heard that phrase many, many times, and in fact helped, pioneer it back in the days. But again, if you have a Christian worldview, then which form of Christianity are you talking about? Do you have a Catholic worldview? Do you have a Pentecostal worldview? Do you have a Baptist worldview? Do you have an Episcopalian worldview? So you see what I mean is you can't say that you have a Christian worldview simply because you're a follower of Christ, because there are people who follow Christ across the entire spectrum of behaviors and beliefs. So be careful when you're assuming that you have a Christian worldview, because again, which form of Christianity do you choose? And you may be saying to yourself, well, the real Christianity, of course, which is a trap. It's an intellectual trap, And you got to be careful because, and the reason it's so important to understand this is that these phrases have been used by smart people to manipulate you, to exploit you, the things that they want from you. And so that's not, I don't think anyway, what Christ had in mind for us. We were not to be homogenized. We were to think for ourselves based upon the teachings of Christ. And I really think that that's what people mean when they say they have a biblical worldview or a Christian worldview. They're talking about their own personal worldview. And that's something that's just a little bit different because it's not objective. It doesn't stand as absolute because your beliefs, your worldview, your perspective is filled with assumptions that are based on your own experiences. It does, however, represent your dignity, which is why it stings so much when anybody suggests otherwise to you. And I'm not here to judge anybody about their personal space or their personal beliefs or their personal worldviews. But what I am trying to say is, please rethink the concept that your worldview is absolute, because the chances are that it's not. So why do we need to examine this or re-examine this or deconstruct it, as I would say? It's because it's a really slippery slope, and it's used by those who really want something from you. So it's not necessarily in your best interests, but it's almost always in the best interests of the one who is teaching you this. This is especially true when it gets to any form of absolutism. You cannot assume that the speaker represents your worldview, so please don't. We claimed to present at CBN all those years ago that we offered news from a biblical worldview, from a biblical perspective. We were TV journalism with a different spirit, and that different spirit we often contended was, from the Bible. So, did we present news from a biblical worldview? Not really. We presented news from a politically conservative point of view. And it's very dangerous and slippery when you start, using or interchanging those words, because, a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview and a conservative political worldview are not the same thing at all. One serves political means or how you're interacting with the culture, and another represents your own inner spiritual beliefs. So if I see one, difficulty that Christian people have, it's separating these two. And I would encourage you to do so, because life is just a whole lot more complicated than that view would represent. So, I think we gave a lot of good advice at CBN. Like we were always telling people to get out of debt. That was a good piece of advice then, and it certainly is a good piece of advice today. But we also, gave a lot of bad advice too, like, suggesting that a Republican worldview was actually a biblical worldview. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about very specific things in the weeks ahead that relate to my experience with this, not only at CBN, but in the many years that followed my experience as Pat Robertson's executive producer. I want to talk about blind support for Israel, because that's a whole lot more complicated than you think. I want to talk about abortion and how your views about that were formed. I am very much pro-life, if you will, but I do take a slightly different take on the whys of that. And then I want to talk about the fallacy of a liberal press, which is one of the big things that we hammered home always, and now it's become or it's reached a level that is really quite dangerous, and I'm serious about that. So I hope you'll join me. I don't have, all the answers. I'm not here as an answer guy. I want to ask questions, and my hope is that you will examine those questions for yourself in the weeks and months ahead, because this is really, really important to us as individuals, as families, as communities, and most certainly on behalf of our political system, because we've really gotten into some wacky areas of late, and we need to talk about it. So I hope you join me next time. Until then, this is Terry Heaton, author of The Gospel of Self, How Jesus Joined the GOP. I'll see you next time.